It began with 9 men in a city of dust and stone, in the year when most people could not read and the world seemed impossibly vast. Imagine for a moment Jerusalem, 1119. The dust of the First Crusade has only recently settled. The screams have faded from the streets. The blood has long since soaked into the earth and dried to a memory that no one speaks of anymore, though everyone remembers it. And now, in the quiet aftermath of conquest, a handful of knights made a decision in candlelight that would echo across 9 centuries, rippling through kingdoms and centuries, through cathedrals and courtrooms, through legend, and into the very bones of European history itself. The evening light is falling across the ancient stones. You can almost feel the heat of the day still radiating from the limestone walls, that particular warmth that stone holds long after the sun has begun its descent. Somewhere in the old city, a bell tolls. The sound carries strangely in that hour between day and night, when the world feels caught between 2 states of being. In a modest chamber, perhaps near the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, perhaps in a hostel near the pilgrim roads, 9 men sit together. Their names would become legendary, though at this moment they are simply men, worn by travel, by the weight of what they have seen. They are knights, yes, but not the glittering, jeweled knights of songs and stories. They are something quieter, something more necessary. What these 9 men understood, in that candle-lit room, was something that few people had yet grasped. The roads to Jerusalem were drowning in blood. Thousands of pilgrims made the journey each year, drawn by faith and the promise of redemption. But between the European kingdoms and the Holy Land lay 1,000 miles of hostility, bandits, thieves, hostile tribes, and a landscape that offered no mercy to the unprepared or unarmed. These pilgrims were lambs. They came with empty hands and lighter hearts, seeking grace, seeking penance, seeking connection to the sacred ground where Christ had walked. Instead, they found robbery, they found violence, they found, too often, unmarked graves in the sand. So these 9 knights made an oath. It was not a grand gesture. It was something deeper than theatricality. They took vows of poverty, binding themselves to own nothing, to hold nothing, to be bound only by their word and their purpose. They swore to protect. They swore to be present on those dangerous roads where pilgrims moved like ghosts through a hostile landscape. They would be the sword that protected the unarmed. They would be the presence that said, "You are not alone in this wilderness." This is how the Knights Templar were born, not with fanfare, not with crowns or ceremony, but with a simple promise made by exhausted men in a room where candlelight flickered against ancient walls. The glow of the flame illuminates their faces as they speak the words that bind them. In that moment, none of them could have known. None of them could have imagined that they were founding something that would grow into a vast network spanning 2 continents. That they were beginning something that would accumulate wealth beyond measure, that would hold the treasures of kings, that would be feared by popes and monarchs alike, that within less than 2 centuries, their order would number in the thousands, that their commanderies would stand in every significant city in Christendom, that their name alone would conjure both reverence and suspicion, that 900 years later, their story would still be told, still be debated, still be surrounded by mystery and myth and unanswered questions. But for now, in 1119, it is simply 9 men making a choice. It is simply a moment when necessity and faith and courage came together in a way that changed everything that came after. This is where we begin our journey. If you're drawn to stories that unfold across centuries, tales where a single decision creates waves that travel through kingdoms and shake the foundations of power, then I invite you to subscribe to the Knights Templar, the entire story of 900 years from crusade to conspiracy, because what unfolds from this moment in Jerusalem is a story of faith and warfare, of wealth and suspicion, of men bound by oath who would eventually face accusations that still spark debate in our own time. This is the story of how 9 knights became an empire, how an empire became a legend, and how a legend, once created, takes on a life of its own, forever beyond the reach of simple truth. The candlelight flickers. Outside, the night is deepening over the ancient city, and our story, truly vast, truly intricate, is only beginning. The world that emerged from the First Crusade was a fractured place. Jerusalem had fallen to the Christian armies in 1099, after weeks of siege and a bloodbath that would echo through centuries. Walls breached, defenders overwhelmed, the streets running with a violence so total that even the victors found themselves shaken by what they had done. And yet, as the dust settled and the triumphant banners were raised above the Holy Sepulchre, a curious problem began to unfold. The Crusade had been won. The Holy Land was, for the first time in nearly 500 years, in Christian hands. But what to do with it? What to do with the vast distances between the Mediterranean ports and Jerusalem? What to do with the pilgrims who now felt called to walk where Christ had walked, to kneel in the places where he had suffered and risen? The roads from the coast inward were lined with the bones of those who had made the journey. Bandits roamed the passes. Local Muslim raiders, displaced but not defeated, watched the pilgrim caravans with hunger. A man traveling from Jaffa toward Jerusalem in the early years of the 12th century faced days of exposure, of constant vigilance, of the real possibility that he would not arrive alive. The women who walked these roads, there were always women, wives and daughters seeking their own salvation, were particularly vulnerable. A merchant's caravan might be attacked at the pass near Ramla. A small group of monks seeking the Desert Fathers' tombs could be robbed and left to die of thirst. The very victory that had opened the Holy Land to Christian worship had also made it unsafe, a paradox that gnawed at the consciences of the knights who had helped win it. Into this disorder came a French knight named Hugues de Payens. He was not particularly famous. He was not especially wealthy. What he was, it seems, was observant. Hugues had arrived in the Holy Land, possibly in 1104 or thereabouts. The precise date is lost. Absorbed into the mists of medieval record-keeping, and he had seen something that troubled him deeply. He had watched pilgrims beaten at crossroads. He had seen families turned back, not by walls, but by the weight of terror. And he had begun to imagine a different possibility. What if knights, trained warriors bound by sacred oath, existed for a single, focused purpose? Not conquest, but protection. Not plunder, but charity. Not the pursuit of worldly glory, but the defense of the defenseless? The idea was not entirely new. The late 11th century had already seen the rise of various military guilds, proto-military monastic communities, men seeking to marry the sword with the soul in different ways. But what Hugues imagined was more coherent, more ambitious, and more radical. He envisioned an order of knights who would live under monastic vows, poverty, chastity, obedience, but who would practice them not in cloisters, but on the exposed roads of Judea. They would have neither personal possessions nor families, nothing to distract them from the sacred work of safeguarding the pilgrim paths. They would be a standing army of mercy, funded collectively, answerable to the Pope alone. Hugues was not working in isolation. With him were 8 other knights. The exact names of some remain uncertain, caught in the fuzzy boundary between history and legend, but prominent among them were Godfrey de Saint-Omer and the Count of Brittany. What bound them was not kinship or territorial alliance, but a shared conviction that the victory of the First Crusade demanded stewardship, not abandonment. They established themselves in Jerusalem around 1119, taking their name from the Temple of Solomon, or more precisely, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, that the Crusaders had renamed the Temple of Solomon, believing it stood on the site of the ancient Jewish sanctuary. The poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. That was their formal title, though history would know them simply as the Templars. In those early years, they were indeed poor. This was not poverty as an ideal, though that would come later, but poverty as literal fact. They had no endowment. They had no substantial properties. They possessed horses that were old and worn. A seal was created for their order, and it depicted 2 knights upon a single horse, not because of some mystical significance, though centuries of interpretation would attach such meaning to it, but because there was not enough coin to give every knight his own mount. When a Templar needed to travel, he rode. When his brother needed a horse, his brother rode, and the first knight waited his turn with patience. In the accounts and letters of these early years, there is a tone of humble earnestness. Men who believed themselves engaged in modest, necessary work, rather than the founding of a great military institution. Yet the work they did mattered immediately. The pilgrim roads began to change character within a few years. A traveler in 1120 or 1121 could expect, if fortunate, to encounter Templar patrols, small mounted groups, moving with purpose and vigilance along the routes from Jaffa and Caesarea toward the interior. These knights did not fight grand battles. They did not conquer new territory. They simply rode the roads and made them safer. When bandits saw the white surcoat with the red cross, a symbol adopted later, but the practice itself immediate, they often withdrew. When a caravan came under attack, Templar reinforcements could sometimes be summoned. It was modest work, often repetitive, occasionally dangerous, and it filled a need that nothing else was addressing. The desperation of this need is difficult, perhaps, for a modern ear to fully absorb. In the medieval imagination, pilgrimage to the Holy Land was not a casual tourism. It was an act of profound spiritual significance, a journey undertaken often only once in a lifetime, sometimes as penance, sometimes as an act of faith, so consuming that a person might die on the road and consider it the will of God. Entire families would sell their possessions to make the journey. Elderly people undertook the voyage, knowing they might not return. The opening of Jerusalem to Christian pilgrims was not merely a religious victory. It was the fulfillment of a deep, ancient longing. And yet the practical reality was that the journey remained deadly, not from disease or hardship alone, but from calculated violence. How many pilgrims never arrived? How many were robbed and stripped and left? How many women and girls did not survive encounters with bandits who felt no constraint? The Templars would not prevent all such tragedies. They were few, spread across vast distances, but their presence shifted the calculus of risk. For the first time, a pilgrim could imagine making the journey with some reasonable hope of safety. Within this context, the growth of the order begins to make sense. It was not growth driven by conquest or territorial ambition, but by the simple recognition that the work was needed and that the workers were effective. Nobles across Christendom began to donate lands and rights to the Templars, understanding that their contributions would fund the protection of pilgrimage roads in perpetuity. A knight might grant a village's revenues to the order in exchange for prayers for his soul. A bishop might deed property to them as an act of piety. Within a decade of their founding, the Templars held lands in the Kingdom of Jerusalem itself, and increasingly in Europe, in France, in England, in Spain, in the Italian states. But these donations were not yet understood as the building of a great international institution. They were understood, rather, as support for a necessary local work. A pilgrim traveling in 1125 would have known of the Templars. He might have been grateful for their presence, but he would not have foreseen that the order he knew as a handful of knights on dusty roads would, within 50 years, rival kings and popes in influence. For now, in these early years, they were simply there. They watched the roads. They trained. They prayed in their chapter house in Jerusalem, spoke little, ate simple food, and carried out the vows they had sworn. The world was slowly beginning to notice them, and the Church, always watchful of new movements, was beginning to consider what they might become. In those first decades after their founding, the Knights Templar owned almost nothing. They lived in profound austerity, a deliberate choice that set them apart from every other military order that would emerge around them. Where other commanders might display their station in fine cloth or jeweled ornaments, the Templars wore plain white mantles with a red cross stitched onto the breast, and they owned communal weapons and horses shared among the brotherhood. A knight might sleep on straw, eat simple bread and dried fish, and spend his mornings in prayer before riding out to patrol the dangerous roads between the Holy Land's sacred sites. This voluntary poverty was not mere theatricality or ascetic excess. It was, in many ways, a necessity born of circumstance. The order had begun with almost no endowment. Its early members were younger sons and landless knights, men without vast inheritances to draw upon. Yet even as that poverty continued, there was something almost paradoxical about it, something that would define the Templar mystique for centuries to come. They had chosen to renounce wealth as a spiritual principle, and that choice would become their most powerful form of propaganda. The seal of the order captured this contradiction perfectly. Two knights sharing a single horse, crowded together on one steed, was the image chosen to represent the Templars during their earliest years. What did this image suggest to those who encountered it? At one level, it spoke of poverty, a community so dedicated to their calling and so lacking in resources that they could not afford to mount each warrior separately. But at another level, it whispered something far more profound about brotherhood, about the willingness of these men to literally share burdens, to trust one another with their lives in the most intimate way. Two bodies on one horse, a symbol of solidarity in service to a purpose larger than individual comfort or station. And yet, as we trace the arc of the Templar story forward from those austere early years, we encounter a transformation that was swift and almost dizzying in its scale. Within 2 decades of their founding, the order had begun to accumulate not poverty, but extraordinary wealth and influence. This was not because the Templars abandoned their vows or grew corrupt overnight. Rather, they became the beneficiaries of a kind of enthusiasm, a fervor among European nobility and the church itself, that few institutions in medieval history have ever experienced. The process began quietly enough. Local lords who saw the Templars at work in the Holy Land, protecting pilgrims and fighting Saracen forces, began to donate lands and property to the order. These were not trivial gifts. A nobleman might grant an entire commandery, a fortified house with surrounding lands, as a way of supporting the Templar mission, while simultaneously securing prayers for his own soul. In the medieval worldview, where the fate of one's eternal soul was the paramount concern, endowing a military monastic order was an act of profound piety. And the Templars, in their turn, accepted these gifts with solemn gratitude, vowing to use them in service to the Crusade. But something curious happened as these donations accumulated. The order did not spend all that it received. It invested carefully. It managed lands with surprising sophistication. It accepted donations of cash and precious objects, items that might have seemed frivolous to an earlier generation of knights, but which, in the hands of shrewd administrators, became tools of economic power. The Templars began to build not just military fortresses, but administrative centers, commanderies that were part monastery, part castle, part administrative building. Each one was a node in a growing network that spanned from London to Jerusalem, from Paris to the Iberian frontier. The turning point came with the intervention of Bernard of Clairvaux, that great reformer and orator, whose voice would shape the religious consciousness of the 12th century. When Bernard learned of the Templars through the letters and reports of those who had encountered them in the Holy Land, he became convinced that he had witnessed the birth of something genuinely new, a fusion of monastic spirituality and martial valor that had never been achieved before. Here were warriors living under a rule, bound by vows of poverty and chastity, just as monks were, yet consecrated to the purpose of holy war. It was a marriage of two traditionally opposing callings, and Bernard saw in it the hand of divine providence. Bernard decided to become the Templars' great advocate and propagandist. He would write the rule that would govern their behavior, the monastic constitution that would define every moment of their existence, from the moment they woke to the prayers they spoke before sleep. But more importantly, he would write the words that would make them matter in the eyes of Christendom. When Bernard spoke in favor of the Templars, bishops listened. When he wrote, the Pope paid attention. Kings began to look upon the order not merely as soldiers but as holy men doing sacred work, and sacred work, in the medieval mind, merited sacred reward. The donations that had trickled in before now began to flow like a river swollen by spring melt. Estates and castles, forests and mills, villages and churches. The Templar order accumulated landed property across the Christian world, at a pace that was truly extraordinary. In England alone, by the end of the 12th century, the Templars held more than 600 manors. In France, their holdings were even more extensive. They became, almost without intending it, one of the largest landowners in medieval Europe. The order that had begun with nothing owned, quite literally, everything. How does an institution make such a transition from poverty to abundance without losing its soul? This is perhaps one of the central tensions of the Templar story, and it would echo through the centuries ahead. For now, in this moment of their ascent, they seemed to accomplish it with grace and purpose. They took the wealth that came to them and channeled it toward fortifications, toward the maintenance of their military machine, toward the support of the Crusade. They became richer, yes, but they insisted that their riches served a higher cause. And then, gradually, the understanding began to shift. The order that had once symbolized poverty, through two knights sharing one horse, was now, in the minds of many observers, the embodiment of power and resources. The question was beginning to form itself in certain minds, though it would not be asked openly for some time yet. What happens when an institution becomes so powerful, so independent, so wealthy that it answers to no earthly authority save the Pope himself? What happens when kings and bishops find themselves in debt to an organization that owes them nothing, that follows no law but its own rule and the directives of Rome? These were dangerous questions, questions that would eventually cost the order everything. But for now, as the 12th century moved toward its close, the Templars stood at the apex of their influence, admired, honored, feared perhaps, but seemingly unassailable in their power and their righteousness. In the early decades of the 12th century, there existed in Europe a profound spiritual crisis that few could quite name. The Church had spent generations wrestling with a troubling contradiction. Monks lived in prayer and contemplation, bound by vows of poverty and obedience, their hands devoted to copying scripture and tending gardens. Knights, by contrast, existed in the world of violence and blood, their swords raised against enemies real and imagined, their wealth accumulating through conquest and vassalage. These two paths seemed irreconcilable. How could a man serve God while drawing a blade? How could one follow Christ while riding to war? The 9 knights who guarded the pilgrimage roads in Jerusalem had stumbled upon something that troubled the settled hierarchies of Christendom. They were warrior monks. They took monastic vows, yet they trained in combat. They prayed in the morning and fought in the afternoon. They embodied a paradox that made many bishops uneasy, and not a few theologians skeptical. It was Bernard, the abbot of Clairvaux, who would transform this troubling paradox into something not merely acceptable, but spiritually necessary. Bernard was perhaps the most influential voice in the church of his era, a man whose letters were read by popes and princes, whose words could elevate or condemn, and in the late 1120s, as the Order of the Temple was still finding its footing, struggling for legitimacy among the clergy and the nobility alike, Bernard turned his considerable eloquence toward defending these warrior monks. He wrote what would become known as De Laude Novae Militiae, or In Praise of the New Knighthood. It was a document that would reshape how Christendom understood the relationship between prayer and warfare, between monasticism and worldly action. Bernard began with a striking rhetorical move. He did not try to merge the monastic and martial traditions by softening either one. Instead, he elevated the new knighthood by arguing that it represented something fundamentally different from the knighthood that had dominated Europe until then. The knights of the world, he wrote, served vanity, ambition, and greed. They fought for glory and gold. They adorned themselves with jewels and fine cloth. They pursued women and collected lands. In Bernard's eyes, they were spiritual failures, knights of the flesh rather than the spirit. But the Templars, he argued, embodied a new ideal entirely. They were, in his vision, monks first and foremost. The rule they followed was monastic. Their vows were sacred vows. Their poverty was genuine, yet they wielded the sword not for personal gain, but for Christ. They fought to protect the faithful. They shed blood not out of pride, but out of duty. They stood at a threshold between two worlds, embodying the best of both, the discipline of the cloister combined with the courage of the battlefield. It is worth pausing here, in the quiet of the evening, to consider what Bernard was truly arguing. He was offering a new answer to an ancient question. Could violence be sanctified? Could the spilling of blood become a form of prayer? The Church had long taught that some violence could be justified in defense of the faith, yet this was something more radical. Bernard was saying that the Templar knight, in riding to battle, in killing infidels, was engaging in an act of sacred devotion. The sword became an instrument of prayer. War became a kind of pilgrimage. This was theologically revolutionary, and Bernard knew it. Yet he framed it not as innovation, but as recovery. He drew upon the language of the early Christian martyrs, of the Old Testament warriors who fought at God's command. He invoked images from the Psalms and the Book of Revelation. He gave the Templars a spiritual genealogy that traced back through the centuries. When he described them as God's soldiers, he was not speaking metaphorically. They were soldiers in a literal sense, but their war was sacred. Bernard's prose was luminous, carefully constructed to appeal to both the rational and the emotional dimensions of faith. He did not simply argue, he painted pictures. He described the Templar in his white surcoat, bearing a red cross, riding across the desert under the blazing sun, enduring hardship and danger without complaint. He depicted the Templar in the refectory, listening to sacred texts while eating simple bread. He showed the Templar in prayer and then in combat, as though these were two chambers of a single heart. What made this document so powerful was that it did not ask Christendom to abandon its suspicions about warfare and violence. Rather, it gave those suspicions a channel. If violence had to occur, if knights had to fight, then let them fight for the highest possible purpose. Let them be monks in armor, pure in intention even if their hands grew stained with blood. The effect was transformative. Within the Church, serious objections to the Templars began to fade. The order was no longer viewed as an anomaly or an experiment, but as a legitimate expression of Christian faith. Bishops who had doubted now became supporters. Popes who had remained cautious now extended their patronage. Bernard had provided what the Templars desperately needed, a theological framework that made them not merely acceptable, but necessary. The document circulated throughout Christendom. It was read in monasteries and cathedrals. It was cited by theologians. It was invoked when disputes arose about the order's privileges or its authority. And in the crusading kingdoms of the Levant, it gave the Templars a sense of purpose that went beyond mere military function. They were not simply soldiers, they were spiritual warriors. They were monks who had answered a higher calling. Yet as we drift deeper into this tale, it is worth considering a softer question. How much of what Bernard wrote about the Templars was observation, and how much was aspiration? He had not spent extensive time in the Holy Land. He did not know the daily lives of these knights in intimate detail. What he had written was, in some sense, an idealized vision. It was a portrait of what the Templars could be, what they ought to be. Whether they truly lived up to this vision, in every moment and every commandery, was a question that Bernard himself may never have fully examined. This distinction between the ideal that Bernard articulated and the reality that would unfold across the centuries would come to matter greatly. For now, though, in the early 12th century, it was the ideal that held sway. In praise of the new knighthood, gave the Templars permission to exist, and more than that, it gave them a reason to believe in their own nobility. They were God's warriors, sanctified by the Church's highest voice. They were monks and knights fused into one calling, a new form of Christendom's answer to the eternal tension between prayer and action, between withdrawal from the world and engagement with it. And with that blessing from Bernard, the order would grow stronger, richer, and more confident in the coming years. The theological ground had been prepared. The spiritual foundation was set. What came next would be the gradual accumulation of power, privilege, and wealth that would reshape their relationship to Christendom itself. It was around the year 1135 when something extraordinary happened in Rome, something that would reshape not only the Templars themselves, but the entire landscape of medieval power. Pope Honorius II, sitting in the papal chair, issued a document that would become the foundation of everything the order would build, the Latin words, Omne datum optimum. Every good gift would echo through the centuries, a charter so generous, so unprecedented in its scope, that it fundamentally altered what the Templars could become. To understand how radical this moment truly was, you must first hold in mind the normal state of things in the medieval church. Most religious orders, even the wealthy ones, remained subject to local bishops and archbishops. They paid tithes. They answered to Rome through intermediaries. Their lands were taxed. Their movements were watched. The structure was hierarchical, regulated, bound by 10,000 small obligations that kept any single power from growing too large. But the Templars, through their champions at the papal court, had begun to whisper a different possibility. Hugues de Payens and his successors had learned something crucial. The Pope, it seemed, was willing to reward those he deemed essential to his vision. And in the Templars, the pontiff saw not merely knights, but a tool, a gleaming instrument through which papal authority could project itself across Christendom, independent of the squabbling kingdoms and rebellious bishops who constantly challenged Rome's reach. The arrangement would be this. The order would serve the Church's highest ideals, and in return, the Church would grant them freedoms that no other institution possessed. The bull, Omne datum optimum, did not come in a single breath, but rather was expanded and reissued over the following decades, each iteration adding another layer of privilege. And what privileges they were! The Templars were exempted from paying the tithes that drained every other religious community. They could use excommunicated priests and collect tithes from territories that would normally be forbidden to them. They could settle their own legal disputes internally, without appealing to local courts. If a Templar committed a crime, his case went not to the bishop or the king, but to the Grand Master and his inner council. They were, in essence, answerable only to the Pope himself, a man who sat, to most practical minds, very far away indeed. Think of what this meant on the ground. A Templar commandery in France, for instance, could accumulate wealth at a pace that would make even the richest bishop envious. They paid no taxes to the king. They owed no allegiance to the local count. And crucially, any Templar who felt threatened or persecuted could call upon the full weight of papal authority to protect him. It was a kind of immunity that had perhaps never been granted before to any military organization, and certainly never to such a mobile, far-flung, autonomous one. The other major powers in Christendom watched this arrangement with something between admiration and barely concealed resentment. Kings in particular understood what was happening. The Templars were becoming, in effect, an international institution, a parallel power structure that could move money and men across borders in ways that no kingdom could quite control. Normandy and England, France and Sicily, Spain and Cyprus, they all contained Templar houses, all interconnected, all reporting up through their own chain of command rather than through any secular authority. It was a kind of ancient globalism, a network that transcended the feudal boundaries that normally held medieval life in rigid compartments. And the money. How the money began to flow in those years. Nobles who had taken the cross and survived the journey to the Holy Land needed to make their wills to ensure their estates were protected while they fought. The Templars, trusted and present everywhere, became the natural keepers of those wills and treasures. Pilgrims traveling the dangerous roads to Jerusalem no longer needed to carry heavy purses of gold. They could deposit their wealth at one Templar house and withdraw it at another, thousands of miles away. It was revolutionary, this simplicity. It was profitable beyond measure. The independence granted by Omne datum optimum transformed the Templars from a military order dependent on the goodwill of local authorities into something far more formidable, a genuinely international corporation, answerable to no secular power, and the Pope, in his wisdom, or perhaps his calculation, had given them that independence, believing they would forever remain grateful, forever loyal to the Church that had elevated them so far above their rivals. How quickly certainties can shift, how easily a grant of privilege can become a source of envy when other powers grow hungry. But in those mid-12th century years, when the seal was still new and the parchment still fresh, the Templars seemed blessed beyond all other men. Within the stone walls of the commandery, life moved to a rhythm that belonged neither fully to the monastery nor entirely to the garrison, but existed in the space where both disciplines intertwined like morning vines around ancient stone. The rule of the order, that carefully composed set of laws governing every hour and every gesture, became the skeleton upon which Templar existence hung, a framework so detailed, so precise, that it prescribed not merely when a knight should pray, but how many times, in what posture, facing which direction, and with what words held in the mouth like coins held in a closed fist. Imagine waking in the pre-dawn darkness, long before the first light touches the eastern windows. The dormitory is cold, the air carries the breath of dozens of men. A bell sounds, not a gentle chiming, but a deliberate, almost harsh tolling that breaks sleep like ice breaking on a winter river. This is matins, the first office of the day, and it comes when most of the world is still dreaming. The knights rise without hesitation, without the luxury of groaning or stretching, and they move through the darkness toward the chapel with the same discipline they would show walking into battle. Their feet know the way, their bodies know the rhythm. This is not rebellion, this is belonging. The chapel glows with candlelight, and here, in the quietness before dawn, the Templars chant. The words are Latin, flowing and ancient, and they have been chanted in this same form for centuries before these particular men were born, and will continue long after they turn to dust. The psalms rise and fall. The responses echo back and forth across the stone, like prayer itself is a conversation between the knights, and something vast and invisible that fills the spaces between the words. Matins lasts perhaps an hour. When it ends, the knights return to the dormitory, lie down again upon straw mattresses, and wait for sleep to return before Lauds begins as the first true light breaks across the horizon. This was not punishment disguised as piety. It was, rather, the very structure that the order believed would sanctify a warrior's life, would transform the act of bearing arms into something approaching holiness. The rule, written in the Norman French of the day, practical and occasionally stern, laid out the entire architecture of this fusion between monastic devotion and military purpose. A Templar's day was not divided into hours of prayer followed by hours of rest. Instead, the prayer and the labor were woven together like threads of different colors making a single cloth. After Lauds, as the sun rises, come the practical necessities. Breakfast is simple: bread, sometimes cheese, weak ale. No one speaks. Reading aloud from holy texts accompanies the meal. Then comes the work of the commandery. Horses must be groomed and exercised. Armor must be inspected and maintained. The fields beyond the walls require attention. The accounts must be kept, and the Templars were meticulous with numbers, recording every coin, every grain of wheat, every transaction with a precision that would eventually make them the bankers of Christendom. A knight might spend his morning mucking stalls or working ledgers. He might spend his afternoon training with sword and lance. He might spend his evening copying manuscript pages in the scriptorium, his hands learning the discipline of writing as thoroughly as they learned the discipline of combat. The vows themselves were absolute in their simplicity. Poverty meant that a knight owned nothing. Not even the clothes upon his back belonged to him. They belonged to the order, and he wore what was assigned. Not the horse he rode, not the weapons in his care, not the small personal possessions that a monk might keep and cherish. The rules specified that a Templar should have 2 tunics, 2 pairs of breeches, shoes if the climate demanded them, a cloak, a mantle with the red cross emblazoned upon it. That was all. Some sources suggest that this extreme poverty was meant as a constant reminder that a Templar's trust lay in God and the Order, not in the accumulation of earthly goods, not in the building of personal wealth or family legacy. One might wonder whether such deprivation also created a powerful cohesion among the men. When every knight possessed exactly the same, there could be no hierarchy of comfort, no resentment born of unequal distribution, no sense that some were favored above others through material privilege. Chastity was equally stringent. A Templar took a vow of celibacy. He could not marry. He could not keep a woman's company except in the most formal circumstances. He could not even speak privately with a woman unless a witness was present. The rule forbade him from hunting certain animals, the lion, the leopard, though he could hunt other game. The rule forbade him from dicing or gambling or attending tournaments, though this restriction was sometimes honored more in the writing than in the practice. The rule forbade elaborate clothing, jewelry, fancy spurs, or anything that might suggest personal vanity. A knight who broke his vow of chastity faced severe punishment. A knight who was discovered with money of his own faced expulsion. Obedience was the third vow, but perhaps the most demanding of all. A Templar must obey his master without hesitation. The master's word was law within the commandery. There was no room for individual preference, no avenue for negotiation, no space for a knight to say that he believed the order given to him was unjust or unwise. You obeyed. That was the covenant. In exchange, the order promised you protection, sustenance, brotherhood, and the profound comfort of existing within a structure so complete that you need never again wonder whether you were making the right choice. You were told what to do. You did it. Your conscience was, in a sense, held by the order itself. The rhythm that governed all this, the constant cycling between prayer and labor, discipline and devotion, solitude and communal life, created something quite distinct from ordinary monasticism. A Benedictine monk in a peaceful monastery might spend 6 hours a day in prayer, and the remainder in work, study, and contemplation. A Templar might spend 5 hours in prayer spread throughout the day, often in fragments that interrupted other tasks, creating a kind of spiritual seasoning upon the whole of his existence, rather than a distinct portion of it. He was never fully a monk, and he was never fully a soldier. He existed in the threshold between, perpetually reminded through the rule itself that his sword arm served a sacred purpose, that his vows bound him to something higher than conquest or glory or the ordinary ambitions of men. And this, perhaps, is what made them so formidable. A typical soldier might grow weary or demoralized or bored with his duties. A typical monk might become complacent in his solitude. But a Templar, waking before dawn, chanting in darkness, then spending the day maintaining weapons and record books and fields and walls, living alongside dozens of other men under absolute obedience to a master, denied any personal possession, any romantic attachment, any escape from the constant presence of the order's demands. Such a man lived in a state of perpetual, disciplined attention. He could not drift. The bells would not allow it. The rule would not allow it. The other knights watching him, reporting any infraction, holding him accountable to standards that admitted no compromise, they would not allow it. This was not, historians suggest, experienced by most Templars as oppression. The rule itself indicates that the order was recruiting men who wanted this structure, who sought it, who understood that the surrender of personal will might be the price of belonging to something greater than themselves. The rule speaks occasionally of punishment, yes. A knight caught in theft might lose his cloak, might be imprisoned in the commandery for a period of time, might face more severe consequences for serious breaches. But there is also throughout the rule a gentle concern for the welfare of the men. If a knight falls ill, he should be cared for carefully. If he is weak or troubled, the master should counsel him with compassion. The rule exists to preserve both discipline and the spiritual well-being of those bound by it. Day after day, year after year, the bells rang in countless commanderies scattered across Europe and the Holy Land, and thousands of men lived according to this rule. They rose before dawn, they prayed, they worked, they ate in silence, they slept on straw, they owned nothing, They went where they were sent. They fought when commanded to fight. They endured, and in enduring, they became something that medieval Christendom had never quite seen before. Warriors so thoroughly disciplined, so completely devoted, so united by common purpose and shared deprivation, that they became, in a sense, invincible, not because they were better swordsmen necessarily, but because they moved as one body directed by a single will. By the middle of the 12th century, something remarkable was unfolding across the landscape of Christian Europe, not in the great cathedrals or royal courts where chroniclers typically turned their gaze, but in the quiet establishment of small, fortified estates that would become the sinews of a vast economic network. The Templars had discovered something that perhaps they did not fully anticipate when they first rode out to protect the pilgrim roads, that the architecture of power extended far beyond the reach of a sword. It lived in stone buildings, in account ledgers, in the trust that flowed between knight and merchant, between king and treasury. Imagine, if you will, the English countryside in the 1140s, rolling hills of green broken by copses of oak and ash. Here, in the quiet valleys and on the high ground where armies might once have gathered, there arose a new kind of fortification. These were not castles built for theatrical display or crown-heavy defense, but something more austere, more purposeful. A Templar commandery was typically modest in appearance, a stone keep or tower, a small chapel with a simple altar, dormitories for the knights and their servants, stables for horses, barns for grain and military provisions. Often a wall enclosed the whole, not to shut out the world entirely, but to mark a boundary, a space where the order's rule held absolute dominion. The settlement at Cressing in Essex became one of the earliest of these English foundations, and from there, the network spread like roots through the soil. London itself, near the Thames, became a major stronghold. The Temple there, as it came to be called, would rise to such prominence that even today, centuries after the order's fall, the name clings to the place where once their white mantles moved through candle-lit halls. And what drew the order to establish these far-flung outposts with such deliberate care? Partly, it was the rhythm of their calling. They required bases from which to operate, lands that could feed their brothers, pastures for their horses. But there was something deeper unfolding as well, something that perhaps shifted the very nature of what the order would become. These commanderies began, quite naturally, to accumulate land. Donations poured in from pious nobles who wished to purchase the prayers of warrior monks, from kings who sought to bind the order's loyalty with grants of fertile ground, from widows and merchants who saw in the Templars an institution of permanence and stability in an unstable world. Where other monastic houses hoarded their wealth in silence, the Templars did something different. They set their holdings to work. They pioneered new agricultural techniques, improved the drainage of marshland, established mills and fisheries. The monastery became a center of practical innovation as much as spiritual devotion. Now consider France, where the order had been born and where it would find its deepest roots and, ultimately, its deepest wounds. The Paris Temple, or, more precisely, the headquarters of the order in Paris, developed into something far grander than any commandery in the English shires. It became, in essence, a city within the city, a walled precinct housing not merely knights and their immediate servants, but clerks, money changers, merchants, and an entire apparatus of administration. The very location spoke to the order's ambitions. The temple was positioned in the right-hand bank of the Seine, in a quarter that would come to be known by its name alone, where even today visitors can trace the ghosts of that medieval stronghold in the street names that persist. It was here that the great archive was kept, the records of the order's far-flung empire. It was here that treasuries filled with coin and gemstones accumulated in vaults, guarded by men who had sworn sacred oaths. But the Paris Temple was never meant to be merely a fortress or a monastery transplanted to an urban setting. It was, perhaps more than any other Templar establishment, a symbol of the order's arrival at the very center of earthly power. Kings came to the temple, nobles negotiated treaties in its chambers, It was a space where spiritual authority and temporal authority had learned, quite deliberately, to coexist. Let us drift now toward the southern reaches of Europe, toward the burning frontiers of the Iberian Peninsula, where Christian kingdoms were engaged in their own prolonged struggle against Islamic rule, a conflict that historians call the Reconquista. Here, the Templars took on a character somewhat different from their brothers in the cooler north. These were frontier knights in the truest sense, riding out regularly into conflict, establishing commanderies, not in the settled countryside, but on the dangerous edges of Christian territory. They were, in many ways, more purely military than their English or French counterparts, yet the logic of their landholding followed the same pattern. They accumulated vast estates in Aragon, in Castile, in Portugal, and from these holdings, they drew the resources necessary to maintain a constant military presence. What is striking, when one examines the evidence from this period, is how rapidly the order consolidated these territories. In the space of a few decades, the Templars went from being a protection service to being, quite possibly, the largest landholder in Christian Europe outside of the Church itself. Some historians suggest, and here we must tread carefully, for precise numbers are elusive, that at the height of their power, the order possessed something in the region of 900 commanderies spread across multiple kingdoms. Whether that figure is exact or merely an approximation, the underlying reality was unmistakable. The Templars had become territorial lords on a scale that rivaled minor kingdoms. And with that territorial expansion came something that the order's founders might have found troubling, had they lived to witness it. The slow, almost imperceptible transformation of a military monastic brotherhood into a financial institution. For these commanderies, you see, were not isolated from one another. They were connected by a web of communication, by traveling brothers who carried messages and information, by a sophisticated understanding of logistics and coordination that had been refined through decades of crusading experience. And with that network came the natural evolution of banking services. When a pilgrim set out from London to reach Jerusalem, why should he carry heavy purses of coin through bandit-infested roads? A Templar in London could furnish him with a letter of credit, a document that would be honored by a Templar in Paris, and then by a Templar in the Mediterranean port cities, and ultimately by a Templar in the Holy Land itself. It was a simple idea, elegant in its execution, and it transformed not merely the Templars, but the entire practice of long-distance travel and commerce in the medieval world. Consider what this meant in the practical daily life of the era. A merchant from Flanders, seeking to buy spices from the Levantine traders, no longer needed to arrange for armed escorts to transport his entire fortune across hundreds of miles. Instead, a relatively modest payment at a Templar house in his home city purchased him the security of the order's reputation. The letter of credit bore the Templar seal, and the Templar seal, by the late 12th century, was worth more than many royal seals. It meant that the holder stood under the protection of an organization with knights in every Christian kingdom, with military training that was without peer, with a reputation for honor and administrative precision that had become legendary. And so the pilgrims came, and the merchants came, and the money flowed from one Templar house to another, settling into the vaults and strongboxes in ways that gradually, almost invisibly, transformed the order from a brotherhood devoted to military poverty into something far more complex, a guardian of wealth, a keeper of secrets, a financial power whose interests extended into realms that the founders could scarcely have imagined. Yet in those quiet commanderies, whether in the soft hills of England, the grand precincts of Paris, or the tense frontier settlements of Spain, the daily rhythm of prayer continued. The offices of the canonical hours still marked the passage of each day. The knights still knelt in their simple chapels before dawn. They still took their vows of poverty with utmost seriousness in their individual lives, even as the order they served accumulated treasures that would soon become the object of envious eyes. By the early 12th century, the order had become far more than a protective guild of pilgrims. They had transformed into the military spine of the Crusader kingdoms themselves, and their presence at every significant conflict, whether triumph or catastrophe, would shape the very fate of Christian rule in the Levant for nearly 200 years. In those stone fortresses that rose from the dust of captured cities, the Templars were no longer merely defenders of the pilgrim roads. They were the standing army of the faith, answerable to no local lord, answerable only to their own hierarchy and to Rome. The battles they fought were not abstract struggles of ideology, though certainly those mattered. They were visceral contests for land, for water, for the passages that controlled trade and survival in an unforgiving landscape. The Templars understood this with the clarity that comes from years of discipline and unwavering purpose. They garrisoned the frontier fortresses, those desolate keeps that ringed the edges of Christian territory like sentries watching through an endless night. Safed, Crac des Chevaliers, the castle of Tortosa, stronghold after stronghold bearing the weight of constant vigilance. Some of these fortifications still stand today, their walls still speaking of the endurance required to hold ground where two worlds collided with unceasing force. One engagement in particular came to embody the Templar reputation for reckless courage and tactical brilliance. In the year 1177, King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, the young man known as the Leper King, despite his affliction carrying the conviction of a lion, rode out to face the vast armies of Saladin at a place called Montgisard. The situation seemed impossible, even to those accustomed to impossible circumstances. Saladin had mustered an enormous force, perhaps 10 times the number of the Christian knights who rode to meet him. Baldwin brought with him perhaps 500 knights and mounted men-at-arms, and among them rode the Templars in their white surcoats and crimson crosses, their discipline and training coiled tight as a spring. What happened next became legend, perhaps because it seemed to prove that faith and martial training could indeed triumph against overwhelming odds, or perhaps because it was simply so unexpected that chroniclers could not help but record it with wonder and astonishment. The Templar charge, coordinated with perfect timing, broke through Saladin's formations. The Muslim army, despite its massive numerical advantage, fractured and withdrew. Saladin himself was nearly captured in the chaos of retreat. It was a stunning reversal, a moment when the tide seemed to turn in favor of the Christian kingdoms, when it seemed that the Templars' discipline and courage might prove sufficient to hold what had been won at such cost in the First Crusade. The victory echoed through the Christian world, reinforcing the mythology that surrounded the order, that these warrior monks were somehow invincible, somehow protected by heaven itself. Yet victories like Montgisard were interludes in a longer, slower narrative of decline. The Crusader states, despite all the resources poured into them, all the holy fervor that sent knights and settlers across the sea, were fundamentally unsustainable. They were isolated communities of Christians in a vast sea of Muslim populations who had not vanished, who had not accepted Christian rule as permanent, who were increasingly united under leaders of remarkable capability and determination. Saladin himself, the great unifier, understood something the fractious Christian lords sometimes forgot, that a long view could be more powerful than any single victory. He rebuilt his armies, recruited new alliances, and waited for the moment when Christian unity would falter, when pride and internal conflict would fracture the Crusader states as surely as any military defeat. The Templars, for all their discipline and wealth and unwavering commitment, could not prevent this slow erosion. They fought with skill and courage. They died by the thousands in skirmishes and pitched battles, in ambushes and long sieges. They sent more recruits from Europe, gathered more resources, fortified more positions. But they could not overcome the fundamental mathematics of the situation, that they were outnumbered in a land that grew progressively more hostile, that the pilgrims they had been sworn to protect dwindled as the roads grew more dangerous, that the kingdoms of the East could not sustain themselves indefinitely without constant reinforcement from the West. Between their triumphs and their trials, the Templars accumulated power and influence that extended far beyond the battlefield. They became crucial advisors to the kings and nobles of the Crusader states. They brokered truces, negotiated ransoms, and managed the complex diplomacy that sometimes seemed as important as open warfare. In this role, they were neither always the hawks nor always the doves. They were pragmatists, responding to the demands of survival. If it served the order and the cause, they would fight. If it served better to negotiate, they would do that as well, though always from a position of strength, and always with the understanding that they could never truly lay down their swords. The wealth they accumulated, through donations, through spoils of war, through their role as bankers and merchants, gave them authority that transcended military might. In the great cities of the Levant, the Templar commanderies became centers not only of military organization, but of economic power. They loaned money to crusaders and kingdoms alike. They held valuables in trust. They became indispensable in ways that went beyond their original calling as protectors of pilgrims, though that calling remained at the heart of their identity and purpose. What did the ordinary Templar knight see as he rode through the streets of Acre or gazed from the walls of some remote fortress toward distant hills? Perhaps he saw the great labor of Christendom, the endless effort to hold ground in a hostile land. Perhaps he saw the futility of it all, the slow drain of men and resources toward a cause that seemed increasingly doomed. Or perhaps he simply saw the next day's duties, the prayers to be said, the walls to be guarded, the enemy to be watched for, and found meaning enough in that simple commitment to persistence. The historical record does not often tell us what the individual knight felt or thought, only what he did, and what he did was endure, resist, and fight with the discipline and conviction that defined his order. The fortunes of the Crusader states rose and fell like tides in those decades following Montgisard. Great cities were conquered, then lost. Alliances shifted and reformed. Waves of new crusaders arrived from Europe, bringing fresh enthusiasm and troops that briefly turned the balance. But the underlying current ran in one direction, subtly but inexorably, toward the eventual collapse of Christian rule in the Holy Land. It was not a swift collapse that would come later, with the catastrophe that awaited at Hattin. For now, in these middle years of the 12th century, it was a slower erosion, a gradual loss of territory, a mounting sense among the more perceptive observers that the great endeavor of the Crusades was approaching its crisis. And through it all, the Templars remained, white-cloaked and resolute, serving as both a symbol of Christian endurance and, unwittingly, a reminder of how even the most disciplined and devoted efforts can be insufficient against the grinding pressure of time and circumstance. By the summer of 1187, the great wheel of Crusader fortune had begun to turn, and those who watched the eastern horizon understood it was turning toward darkness. The knights who had ridden out across the Levant for 70 years, building stone keeps and establishing a Christian kingdom where once only Muslim rule had held sway, were about to face an adversary of singular genius and patience. His name was Saladin, and he had spent decades unifying the fractured emirs of the Islamic world into a single, disciplined force. The Templar commanders of that time, men who had inherited the habits of victory from their grandfathers, did not initially perceive the magnitude of the change. They held fortified positions. They controlled the pilgrimage routes. They commanded respect, even in the councils of kings and princes. But the Crusader states themselves had grown weary and divided. The Latin kingdom of Jerusalem was in the hands of a young, leprous king, Baldwin IV, and when he died, succession fractured along lines of ambition and resentment. There were, as always, internal quarrels. There were marriages and divorces of convenience. There was the eternal problem of maintaining cohesion among proud, independent lords, separated by leagues of hostile territory. Saladin, by contrast, had cultivated something the Franks had never quite managed: unified command. He had the loyalty of emirs from Syria to Egypt. He had recruited cavalry, assembled supplies, and planned not a series of raids, but a complete reconquest of the Levantine coast. In the spring of 1187, he moved his army northward, and the Crusader states began to mobilize their defenses. The immediate trigger was a small matter of honor and provocation. A man named Reynald of Châtillon, a troublesome crusader lord with a fortress at Kerak, had intercepted one of Saladin's caravans and mistreated members of the Sultan's family who were traveling within it. It was an insult that Saladin had already endured with remarkable patience. But now he saw an opportunity. He sent word that he would march on Kerak in early July, and the Crusader response was to gather their scattered forces for a pitched battle. The command was given to Guy of Lusignan, who was no tactician and even less a man of intuitive wisdom. On the 5th of July, 1187, the Crusader army, including a substantial contingent of Templar knights, under their Grand Master, Gerard de Riedfort, set out from the town of Safaria to meet Saladin's forces. The day was scorching. The landscape between Safaria and the Horns of Hattin, twin volcanic peaks that rose from the parched earth, was exposed and waterless. The army marched toward those heights, and as they drew closer, something became clear that perhaps should have been clear before. Saladin's forces were already in position, waiting, and there would be no simple cavalry charge to scatter them as had sometimes occurred in earlier encounters. What unfolded on the 4th and 5th of July was one of the most decisive and catastrophic defeats the Crusader movement would ever suffer. Saladin's archers, positioned with meticulous care, rained arrows upon the armored knights who were already exhausted from heat and thirst. The Crusader cavalry attempted repeated charges, but the Muslim lines held firm. By the second day of battle, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Crusader forces were surrounded. Many were killed in the fighting. Others, in scenes of chaos and desperation, threw down their weapons and surrendered when it became clear that resistance was futile. Among those captured was the Grand Master of the Templars, Gerard de Riedfort himself. The knights who survived the slaughter, not all of them, for Saladin ordered the execution of many of the captured knights and nobles, were led away into captivity. The Templar commander found himself a prisoner of war, a strange inversion of the role he had played for decades. He would eventually be ransomed, but the blow to his order's prestige was immeasurable. For the first time in living memory, the Templars had not merely failed a battle, they had been decisively crushed. The news of Hattin rippled across the Christian world like a stone cast into still water. If such a force could be defeated, then what had seemed permanent, the Crusader kingdoms, the fortified cities, the network of keeps and churches, suddenly appeared fragile. Saladin did not pause to celebrate. He moved immediately upon the fortified cities of the coast. Jerusalem, the great prize that had been held by Christians for 88 years, was now isolated and vulnerable. The city's defenders were few. The relief forces that might have been summoned had been shattered on the slopes of Hattin. By October, after a brief siege, the gates of Jerusalem opened, and the holy city returned to Islamic rule. For the Templars, this moment constituted a kind of ending, and, perhaps paradoxically, a beginning. Their whole raison d'etre for nearly a century had been bound up with the defense of the Crusader states and the Christian presence in the Holy Land. Now, in the aftermath of Hattin and the loss of Jerusalem, that mission seemed suddenly hollow. Many of the knights who survived the battle were traumatized, and let us not shy away from that word, for trauma is real, and it was present in those men. By what they had witnessed, they had charged into battle believing in the righteousness of their cause and the superiority of their training. They had been proven catastrophically wrong on both counts. What is sometimes overlooked in the historical record, buried beneath accounts of military tactics and strategic decisions, is the psychological dimension of this catastrophe. The surviving Templars had to reconcile the reality they had experienced with the mythology they had inherited. They were supposed to be the elite warriors of Christendom. They were supposed to be invincible. They were supposed to be the monk's soldiers chosen by God to hold the line between light and darkness. And yet they had been surrounded, outmaneuvered, and devastated by an enemy who was, in many ways, simply better prepared. The resilience of the order, however, proved remarkable. Perhaps this was because the Templars were, by their very nature, an institution designed to absorb shock and continue forward. They had taken vows not merely of personal courage, but of corporate loyalty. An individual knight might fail, the order endured. An individual commander might be captured and ransomed. The order found new commanders. The structure of monastic discipline meant that even in the face of profound collective trauma, there were daily rhythms to observe, prayers to chant, rules to uphold. In a sense, the ritualized life of the temple provided a kind of ballast that kept the organization from capsizing entirely. In the weeks and months following Hattin, the surviving Templar commanderies across the Levant, the fortified outposts that had seemed so solid and permanent, were hastily abandoned, garrisoned with reduced forces, or in some cases surrendered to Saladin's advancing armies. Some Templars retreated toward the coast, toward the remaining Crusader strongholds that had not yet fallen. Others made their way to the ports of Tyre and Acre, maritime cities that still held out against the advancing Muslim forces. The order was, in essence, falling back to its last positions, consolidating what remained. The great narrative of the Templars as a triumphant, expanding force came to an end at Hattin. What followed was a long, slow contraction, not immediate dissolution, but a gradual redefinition of purpose and geography. The knights who had ridden proudly across the Levantine landscape, secure in their mission and their righteousness, now found themselves in a more uncertain world. And yet it was from this moment of profound loss and disorientation that the Templars would eventually discover other sources of power, other forms of influence, that would sustain them for another century and a half, though not in the way they had imagined. The defeat at Hattin, terrible as it was, would ultimately propel the order in new directions entirely. In the aftermath of Hattin, when the dust had settled over those sunburnt fields and the survivors began their long journey northward, there remained one fortress that would become the Templars' last true sanctuary in the Holy Land. Acre, that ancient port city on the coast of what is now northern Israel, would rise as the new heart of their eastern presence. The journey there was slow, measured by grief and necessity. Knights arrived in ones and twos, then in small companies, bearing the weight of a catastrophe that had seemed, in those final moments before Saladin's army closed in, entirely survivable. The city they entered was already crowded with the wounded, the displaced, the faithful who had fled Jerusalem itself, and into this chaos, the Templars brought something the crusading movement desperately needed. Not hope precisely, but something steadier. Organization, resources, an unshakable certainty that their rule, their discipline, their oath to defend Christendom remained as binding as it had been in the moment of their founding nearly 70 years before. They began immediately to rebuild their fortifications, to gather their surviving soldiers, and to prepare for what would become the Third Crusade, that great and expensive mobilization of European power that would be led by King Richard the Lionheart of England and King Philip Augustus of France. Can you imagine the weight of those negotiations, those discussions held in candle-lit chambers, as the great kings of Europe debated the terms of their expedition? The Templars were no longer simply soldiers. They had become something far more intricate and essential. They were diplomats who understood the languages and customs of both the Islamic world and the fragmented politics of European feudalism. They were keepers of secrets, trusted messengers who could pass between enemy camps and return with knowledge that no ordinary knight could obtain. When Philip Augustus needed to communicate with Richard Lionheart, when disputes arose over strategy or the division of recovered lands, it was often the Templars who provided the neutral ground, the trusted intermediaries who could be believed by all sides because they had sworn their loyalty not to any earthly king, but to the Pope in Rome. Yet something else was happening simultaneously, something quieter and perhaps ultimately more consequential than the sword strikes and cavalry charges that history remembers. The Templars were becoming bankers. Picture a wealthy pilgrim from England or Flanders, a merchant who had decided at last to make the journey to Jerusalem to pray at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. In earlier centuries, such a journey meant carrying vast quantities of coin, traveling in armed caravans, living in constant fear of brigands and thieves. The roads were lawless. Travel was a financial catastrophe waiting to happen, not merely because of the distance, but because of the vulnerability of carrying one's entire fortune across thousands of miles. But now, in these years of rebuilding, something remarkable had begun to take root. The Templars had established commanderies across Europe, outposts from London to Paris to the Iberian Peninsula. What if a pilgrim could deposit his wealth at a Templar house in his home city, receive a letter of credit sealed with the Templar insignia, and present that letter at a Templar house in Acre to withdraw funds in local currency? What if travel could become safe, efficient, almost modern? This was revolutionary. This was the birth of what we would recognize today as the medieval banking system. A pilgrim arrived in Accra with a sealed letter, and Templar financial officers would verify its authenticity through their own secret marks and ciphers. The funds were released. No physical coin had crossed the Mediterranean. No robber on the road to Jerusalem could steal what had never been carried. The Templars had effectively invented the traveler's check, centuries before modern commerce would formalize such instruments. The implications were staggering. Kings began to deposit their treasuries with the Templars. The wealth held in the temple in Paris became legendary. If you needed to raise an army, you could not do so without credit. If you needed credit, the Templars could provide it, because they held the assets of half of Christendom's nobility. The order's seal became more trusted than the seal of kings. A Templar letter of credit circulating through the markets of Europe carried more weight than royal currency. Does this not reveal something fascinating about the nature of power? Money and faith became somehow intertwined in the Templar institution. They were trusted not because they wielded swords, but because they had taken vows of poverty, because their rule forbade them the temptations that corrupted ordinary merchants, because their oath bound them to the church and to principles higher than personal gain. Back in Acre, as the Third Crusade played out in its distant campaigns and temporary victories, the Templars were simultaneously defending the city, managing its affairs, and serving as the financial and diplomatic backbone of the crusading enterprise. They were everywhere at once. A knight would ride out to meet Saladin's envoys under a flag of truce, return with intelligence about enemy movements, then spend the evening recording transactions in the temple treasury, tracking tribute payments and supply requisitions. They moved between worlds with an ease that no ordinary soldier could manage. The Third Crusade itself, for all its pageantry and the fame of its leaders, achieved less than hoped. Richard Lionheart won battles, recovered some coastal territories, but Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands. Yet the Templars endured through it all, their commanderies intact, their networks of loyalty and obligation spreading deeper into the political fabric of Europe with each passing year. They were becoming indispensable precisely because they operated in the spaces between power. They were not lords with ambitions for territory. They were not bishops whose authority derived from the church hierarchy. They were something unique, a military order bound by monastic vows, answerable only to the Pope, yet entrusted with the secrets and wealth of kings. In those quiet hours before dawn in Acre, when the night watch patrolled the walls and the eastern sky had just begun to pale, perhaps a Templar officer would sit alone with his accounting ledgers, watching the numbers accumulate, watching the order's wealth grow year by year, and wonder what such power truly meant. What responsibility came with holding the coin that could topple kingdoms? What burden lay in knowing the secrets that every ruler in Christendom carried in their hearts? The answers to those questions would take many decades to unfold. But in these years of rebuilding, in the aftermath of Hattin, and in the shadow of uncertain futures, the Templars had already transformed from what they had begun as mere knights sworn to protect pilgrims. They had become something far more complex. They were the hidden infrastructure upon which the entire medieval world was learning to depend. By the time the Templars had weathered the storms of the Crusades and established themselves across 2 continents, something unexpected was beginning to unfold in the shadowed halls of their commanderies, something that would reshape not just the practice of pilgrimage, but the very nature of money itself across the medieval world. The transformation was quiet, almost accidental, born not from some grand design, but from a simple, pressing problem. The roads were dangerous, the journey to the Holy Land was perilous, and a man carrying a heavy purse of gold coins was a man with a target painted across his back. Picture yourself, if you will, a merchant or a noble in 12th century France, consumed by the desire to journey to Jerusalem, to walk where Christ had walked, to seek absolution or grace, or merely the profound spiritual weight of standing in those ancient stones. Yet the thought of crossing mountains and deserts with nothing but a leather satchel of coins, the entirety of your worth, your family's future perhaps, would be madness. Bandits infested the roads, unscrupulous guides preyed on pilgrims, wars erupted without warning. And even if you survived the journey with your coins intact, how would you eat? How would you find shelter? How would you navigate the complex negotiations of lodging and supplies in lands where your currency was sometimes worthless and your language meant nothing? The Templars, in their vast network of commanderies stretching from Paris to Jaffa, from London to Acre, suddenly recognized an opening, or perhaps, it would be more honest to say, they stumbled into one and then saw its profound utility. A pilgrim arriving at a Templar house in Paris with a purse full of coins could approach the commander and make a deposit. He would receive in return a letter, a single sheet of parchment bearing seals and signatures, a promise written in formal Latin that any Templar commandery along his route would honor this document and provide him with funds in the local coinage. The pilgrim could then travel light, carrying almost nothing but this letter, this extraordinary piece of paper, and emerge at his destination secure, his money waiting for him in a distant city. This was, in essence, the birth of the medieval banking system, and it was revolutionary in ways that are difficult to fully grasp from our vantage point, when moving money across continents is as simple as a keystroke. But in the medieval world, this was unprecedented. This was alchemy. This was the Templars converting anxiety into security, converting weight into weightlessness. The letters of credit, as they came to be known, bore the signature of the local Templar commander and the official seals of the order, making them trusted across kingdoms because the Templars themselves had become trusted, because their vows of obedience and their reputation for integrity meant something concrete in a world built on suspicion and fragmented allegiances. How did a military monastic order transform into something resembling the architects of finance? The answer lies partly in their very nature. The Templars already moved money, tithes, donations, spoils of war, the accumulated wealth of the faithful, across vast distances. They already maintained detailed records, trained their scribes in the careful notation of accounts, organized themselves with the precision of men who understood that a single error in a ledger could mean the difference between solvency and ruin. They were already, in a sense, running a proto-banking operation simply by virtue of needing to fund their operations across 2 continents. What the letter of credit represented was the formalization of this capability, the opening of this service to the outside world. And because the Templars were exempt from many of the taxes and restrictions that governed other institutions, because they answered only to the Pope and not to local lords or kings, because their commanderies were scattered across political boundaries like islands of independence and influence, they could offer something no single lord, no single city, no single merchant or banker could offer: a genuinely international network of trust and exchange. The implications began to ripple outward almost immediately. Pilgrims came, yes, but so too did merchants and crusaders and nobles traveling for diplomatic reasons. Each of them might carry a letter of credit. Each transaction added weight to the Templar balance sheets, added complexity to their account books, added yet another layer of institutional sophistication. The Templars began to develop a system of internal accounting that tracked, with remarkable precision, the debts and credits flowing through their network. A commandery in England might owe a sum to the house in France. That debt would be recorded, tracked, eventually settled, not through the physical movement of coins, but through the offsetting of other transactions. It is worth pausing here to reflect on what this really meant. For the first time in the post-Roman world, for the first time since the fall of centralized banking systems and the fragmentation of trade networks, a traveler could move substantial wealth without carrying it. He could travel light. He could journey in relative security, his money represented not by deadweight, but by a single sheet of parchment, by the reputation of an institution, by the implicit promise written in every letter the Templars issued. We will honor this. We will keep your money safe. You can trust us across the distance that separates you from your destination. And the Templars, in turn, were beginning to recognize the profound power that flowed from this trust. For in accepting deposits from pilgrims and merchants, they were, in effect, holding other people's money. This money did not sit idle in their commanderies. It was invested, loaned, used to fund further operations, to purchase land, to strengthen fortifications. The same coin that a merchant deposited in Paris might, within weeks, be financing a military campaign in the Holy Land. The Templars were becoming, consciously or not, engaged in what modern economists would recognize as fractional reserve banking, the practice of lending out a portion of the deposits entrusted to them. The Paris Temple, in particular, had become something like a central vault for the order's vast operations. The commander of Paris oversaw not merely a single commandery, but a treasury of extraordinary magnitude, a repository of wealth that drew not just Templar funds, but the deposits of the powerful, kings, nobles, bishops, who recognized that the temple offered security that even their own castles might not provide. The temple in Paris occupied a fortified precinct on the right bank of the Seine, and its walls enclosed not merely a church and dormitories and training grounds, but vaults, strong rooms, archives where the accounts were kept and where the physical wealth was stored. What is particularly striking, when one contemplates this development, is how little celebration it received. There are no grand chronicles announcing the invention of the letter of credit, no papal bulls celebrating the birth of medieval banking. Instead, the transformation happened gradually, almost invisibly, woven into the daily operations of an order that was, fundamentally, a military and religious institution responding to practical necessity. Yet this quiet innovation would outlive the Templars themselves by centuries. The banking systems that would eventually emerge in Renaissance Florence, in medieval Bruges, in the merchant networks of the Hanseatic League, all of them would owe a debt, whether acknowledged or not, to the methods that the Templars had pioneered in their commanderies, their ledgers, their letters of credit. Yet even as the Templars grew more powerful in their distant keeps and counting houses, something ancient and inexorable was shifting across the Levantine shore. The Crusader states, those fragile Christian kingdoms carved into Muslim lands by blood and will and papal blessing, had begun their slow descent into shadow. The great fortresses that once seemed permanent as cathedrals would soon exist only as ruins, and the Order's last century in the Holy Land would be marked by a mounting desperation, a sense that something precious was slipping through their fingers, like sand through an hourglass. By the late 13th century, the great Muslim dynasties of the East had consolidated their strength in ways the fragmented Crusaders could never match. The Mamluks, warrior slaves who had seized control of Egypt and Syria, possessed both military genius and demographic advantage. They understood the terrain, commanded the loyalty of populous cities, and nursed centuries of resentment at Christian occupation. The Templars, for all their discipline and courage, found themselves defending a system that was slowly, inexorably, losing its footing. The tide had turned so gradually that many failed to notice until they were already drowning in it. Acre, that last great Crusader stronghold on the coast of Palestine, had become by the 1280s something close to a medieval free port, a city of merchants and soldiers and refugees, where Christian banners still flew from the seawalls, but where the cracks in the facade were widening with each passing year. The Templars maintained there their largest fortress outside Jerusalem, a garrison of knights that served as both military bulwark and bank, both spiritual sanctuary and place of commerce. From Acre, the order coordinated its holdings, processed its wealth, and maintained the fiction that Christian rule might somehow endure. Yet the surrounding countryside had long since fallen to Mamluk control. The Knights Templar held the city, and little more. The Sultan Qalawun, a Mamluk of fearsome capability and patience, had been circling these Christian enclaves for years, making small conquests, consolidating his power, waiting for the moment when a final assault would meet no meaningful resistance. In 1291, that moment arrived. Do you wonder what it must have felt like, in those final days, to man the walls of a fortress, knowing that relief would never come? The citizens of Acre began to understand, slowly, and then with terrible clarity, that they were going to fall. The Mamluk army that surrounded Acre numbered perhaps 40,000 strong, equipped with siege machinery of great sophistication and supplied with patient determination. The Christians inside the walls numbered perhaps half that, divided among different factions and orders, their unity already fractured by competing interests and old grudges. The Templars formed one part of the defense, along with the Knights Hospitaller and the secular garrison, but even united they could not hold against such overwhelming force. Siege warfare in the medieval period was less about the drama of single heroic stands, and more about the slow mathematics of attrition. How long could supplies last? How much damage could the walls endure? At what point did hope curdle into despair? The siege lasted barely a month, which is to say it was swift by the standards of medieval warfare, but an eternity for those living through it. Contemporary accounts, written by those who escaped or heard the accounts of survivors, describe the pounding of siege engines, the breach of the outer walls, the gradual compression of the Christian forces into smaller and smaller corners of the city. The Templars fought with their characteristic discipline and ferocity, but discipline cannot hold against impossible odds. On May 28, 1291, the city fell. The slaughter that followed was terrible, though perhaps less thorough than the sources sometimes suggest, as medieval chroniclers had a tendency to embellish the tragic. What haunts the historical record most poignantly is not the violence itself, but the evacuation that preceded the final collapse. As it became clear that Acre could not be held, ships began loading refugees, nobility, merchants, clergy, women and children, anyone who could afford passage or claim connection to the right patron. The Templars secured their own escape, as one would expect an organization of their resources and ruthlessness to do. They withdrew with their records, their treasure, their most valuable possessions, but many were left behind. The question of what exactly happened to those who remained, to the servants and the poor, to the ordinary people who had no claim to a place on the evacuation ships, is one that contemporary sources handle with something close to embarrassed silence. The surviving Templars, perhaps 3,000 knights and sergeants in all, scattered like seeds on the wind. Some sailed to Cyprus, which had become by necessity the new headquarters of the Order's eastern operations. Others returned to Europe, carrying with them the weight of an order that had lost its primary reason for existence. For 2 centuries, the Templars had been defined by their role as the defenders of the Holy Land, as warriors sanctified by proximity to Christ's earthly kingdom. That identity, that historical purpose, was now suddenly obsolete. Cyprus became for the Order something like a liminal space, not quite the Levant, not quite Europe, suspended between what had been lost and what might yet be salvaged. The island had been the staging ground for crusades, and it retained something of that role, but it was a refuge rather than a bastion, a place to wait and regroup rather than to launch new conquests. The Templars maintained their monastic disciplines, their military training, their banking operations, even without the great theater of the Crusades to give them purpose. They became, in a peculiar way, an order in search of a mission, growing wealthy and powerful in a shrinking world. Yet even as the Templars retreated to Cyprus and their European strongholds, the legends that would accrue to them were already beginning to take root. The Great Crusades had inspired apocalyptic hopes and cosmic significance in European minds. They were, after all, battles for sacred ground, for the very tomb of Christ itself. When those battles were lost, when the sacred cities fell again to Muslim rule, the psychological blow to Christian Europe was profound. The Templars, as the most visible representatives of that loss, began to accumulate around themselves a certain mythic quality. They had been the last defenders of Christendom's earthly paradise. They had failed, yes, but in that failure there was a kind of terrible grandeur. The retreat from the Holy Land marked something like the beginning of the end for the Order. Though very few understood it at the time, the Templars would continue for another 2 decades, would grow in some ways richer and more powerful than ever before, would maintain their commanderies and their banking houses and their political influence across the courts of Europe. Yet the loss of their sacred purpose, the slow realization that the Crusades as a geopolitical project were becoming increasingly fantastical, these things created a kind of existential void that the Order would struggle to fill. In the quiet of this loss, in the measured tones of a military organization adapting to the loss of its war, the Templars entered a new phase of their long history. They were no longer crusaders in any meaningful sense. They were landowners, bankers, political actors in the European system, a vast corporate entity with military traditions and monastic disciplines. They had ceased to be a necessary force in the machinery of Christendom's expansion into the holy places, and necessity, as history would soon demonstrate, was perhaps the only thing that had been protecting them from becoming something far more dangerous in the eyes of their enemies, an immensely wealthy institution with no clear justification for existing at all. The 13th century was waning toward its close, and across Europe, the great machinery of kingship was beginning to strain under its own weight. In France, a monarch had inherited a kingdom of considerable power but diminishing resources, and he would come to see in the Templars not the noble defenders of Christendom they claimed to be, but an enigma that needed resolving, and perhaps an opportunity that needed seizing. Philip IV, known to history as Philip le Bel, Philip the Fair, took the throne of France in 1285 as a young man of some 17 years. He was shrewd, methodical, and possessed of a quality that distinguished him from many of his contemporaries, an almost bureaucratic coldness in pursuit of what he deemed the interests of his kingdom. Where other kings spoke of honor and Christian duty, Philip spoke increasingly of sovereignty, of consolidation, of the authority of the French crown over all powers that operated within its borders. And within those borders, none stood quite so separate, quite so untouchable, as the Order of the Knights Templar. By the late 13th century, the Templars had become something far different from those 9 knights riding across the dusty roads of Judea 200 years earlier. They were now a financial empire unto themselves. Indeed, many historians suggest they had become something closer to an international bank than a military order. Their vaults held gold and silver not merely from donations and pilgrimage offerings, but from the treasuries of kings and nobles who had entrusted them with deposits. The Paris Temple, that great fortified complex within the capital itself, was rumored to contain more wealth than the royal treasury of France. This fact alone would have been troubling to a king of Philip's temperament, but there was something more that disturbed him, something that went beyond mere wealth. The Templars answered ultimately to no one in France. They were exempt from taxation, not by royal decree, but by papal privilege. Their lands could not be seized. Their officers could not be tried in royal courts. When a Templar broke the law, he was answerable only to his Grand Master, and ultimately to Rome. They maintained their own castles, their own harbors in the Levant and Cyprus, their own network of communication that crisscrossed kingdoms like invisible threads. To Philip, looking out from his palace with the steady gaze of a man who believed in absolute kingship, the Templars represented a challenge to that very absoluteness. The tensions at first were subtle. They gathered like clouds on a horizon, barely noticed at first, then slowly darkening the sky. Philip began, in small ways, to test the boundaries of Templar privilege. He attempted to tax their properties. The Pope reminded him it could not be done. He tried to exercise royal authority over individual Templar knights. He was rebuffed with citations of their independence. These were not violent confrontations, not yet, merely bureaucratic skirmishes, the sparring of institutions testing each other's limits. But with each resistance, Philip's resentment deepened. And then there was the matter of money. Philip, for all his power, was perpetually short of it. The Crusades had drained French coffers for generations. Wars in Flanders, disputes over territories in Gascony and the southwest, the endless demands of maintaining royal authority and noble patronage, all of this required constant expenditure. The Templars, meanwhile, grew wealthier through their banking operations, their commanderies, their careful management of resources. Philip had borrowed from them, as many kings had. The debts mounted, and those debts, one might reasonably imagine, became increasingly burdensome to a monarch who was not accustomed to owing anything to anyone. There is something in the nature of power that cannot easily bear indebtedness. A king can be generous to his subjects. He can distribute lands and titles and privileges as he sees fit. But to be in debt to an order that answers not to him but to the Pope, this was a different matter entirely. One might wonder whether Philip ever lay awake at night considering those vaults in Paris, those treasuries housed in the very heart of his kingdom, guarded by men who owed him nothing. By the 1290s, the situation was becoming openly tense. Philip's counselors, ambitious men, many of them, eager to serve the king's interests and advance their own fortunes, began to whisper in his ear about the Templars. They spoke of the order's arrogance, their refusal to obey royal authority, their secret initiations and exclusive bonds. They hinted at mysteries, at rituals not entirely understood. These counselors, among them men like Guillaume de Nogaret, a lawyer of considerable intelligence and even more considerable ruthlessness, began to suggest that perhaps the Templars' independence was not a virtue but a threat. Perhaps, they murmured, it was time for the French crown to reassert its authority over this anomalous institution. Philip himself, it seems, was conflicted for some years. The order still enjoyed considerable public respect. Recruitment to their ranks remained strong. Noble families continued to seek honor in Templar service. To move against them openly would require not merely military strength, but also a justification that would convince both the Pope and the people of France that such action was necessary and righteous. A king could not simply seize an order of knights without appearing to be a tyrant, without inviting condemnation from Rome. But gradually, the lines were being drawn. The Templars, for their part, seemed largely unaware of how precarious their position had become. They were accustomed to surviving, to adapting, to enduring challenges. They had weathered crusades and defeats, financial crises and shifting political tides. Surely, one might imagine them thinking, they would weather this as well. They were, after all, an institution that had lasted for 2 centuries, that had been sanctioned by the highest powers of Christendom. What could possibly threaten their existence? Yet the air was growing cooler. In the palaces and councils of France, a plan was forming, not yet fully articulated, not yet ready to be executed, but gathering momentum nonetheless. The king's debts to the order's refusal to submit to royal authority, the whispers about strange ceremonies and hidden loyalties, the vast treasures locked within Templar vaults. All of these elements were beginning to coalesce in the mind of a monarch who believed that the absolute authority of the crown should tolerate no rival. Somewhere in the space between ambition and resentment, between financial desperation and ideological conviction, the decision was being made. Not consciously, perhaps, but inevitably, like the slow gathering of a storm that has been building for years. By the autumn of 1307, the Templar order had existed for nearly 2 centuries. They had become, in many ways, woven into the fabric of Christendom itself, their white mantles and red crosses recognized from fortress to city, from monastery to merchant's hall. And yet, on the night of Friday, the 13th of October, in a single coordinated sweep across the Kingdom of France, that world was unmade. King Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair, had for years regarded the Templars with a complicated mixture of envy and resentment. The order answered ultimately to Rome, not to him. Their wealth was vast and largely untaxed. Their independence from royal authority was written into papal bull and church law, layer upon layer of immunity that no other institution in his realm possessed. Philip, however, was a king who believed in the absolute power of the crown, a modern thinker, in some ways far ahead of his age. He had already come into conflict with the Pope himself over matters of taxation and authority. The Templars, with their separate allegiance and their separate treasure, represented everything he saw as a check upon his own power. The arrests came without warning. In the grey hours before dawn, soldiers surrounded Templar commanderies throughout France. Knights were pulled from their chambers, from their prayers, from their daily routines. They were taken to royal prisons, not church prisons, but secular dungeons where the king's justice held sway. This was itself a violation of ancient law. The Templars, as a religious order, should have been subject to ecclesiastical courts, answerable ultimately to the Pope. Philip had overridden that protection entirely. He had placed himself above it. The charges, when they came, were extraordinary. The Templars were accused of heresy, of spitting upon the cross during their initiation ceremonies, of denying Christ, of worshipping a mysterious head called Baphomet, of engaging in obscene rituals, of practicing sorcery. These accusations were unlike anything the order had publicly faced before. Where had such specific claims originated? The evidence, Philip insisted, came from confessions. Templars in his custody had admitted to these acts under interrogation. Here we must pause and hold ourselves in this moment with careful attention. What happened in those dungeons remains one of the most contested questions in medieval history. We know that torture was employed, not as an aberration, but as standard practice within the judicial systems of the time. Torture was, in the legal framework of the medieval world, a recognized tool of investigation, particularly in cases of heresy. When a confession was needed to prove a crime, when the crime seemed almost beyond comprehension, torture was the method by which truth was extracted. This does not make it just. It does not make it acceptable by modern understanding, but it is the historical context we must hold. The interrogators used the rack, the strappado, a method in which the prisoner's hands were bound behind the back and the arms were lifted by rope, dislocating the shoulders, then dropped repeatedly. Some accounts suggest burning, deprivation of food and water, sleep denial. The pain was designed to break resistance, to produce the confession that would justify the king's actions and secure his claims upon Templar wealth. And confessions came. Many of them. Knights admitted to spitting upon the cross. They spoke of the head called Baphomet. They described ceremonies conducted in darkness. They acknowledged that they had never truly believed in Christ, or so the records claim. Some of these confessions were remarkably detailed and remarkably consistent, which suggests either that there was a coordinated lie, that the accused had somehow agreed upon their stories, or that they were responding to leading questions posed by their torturers, shaping their answers to match what their questioners already believed or wanted them to say. But here is where the historical record becomes more intricate still. Some Templars, when brought before church authorities, before bishops and papal representatives, recanted their confessions. They claimed they had said whatever was necessary to stop the pain. They retracted their admissions of heresy. They denied the charges entirely. Others maintained their confessions. Some were questioned multiple times, and their stories shifted. Without modern recording, without transcripts that were not filtered through the bias of the interrogators themselves, we must assemble the truth from fragments and contradictions. What is certain is that the interrogations continued for months. The detained knights were held in various prisons throughout France. Some died in custody, whether from torture, from disease, or from the simple despair of captivity. We often cannot know with precision. Others survived and lived to see trials. The physical and psychological trauma inflicted during this period left marks that endured for years. Those who were eventually released often spoke of the horror they had endured. A few, remarkably, insisted upon their innocence despite everything they had suffered. The question of what the Templars actually believed, what their secret practices, if any, truly were, remains uncertain. Some historians have suggested that certain heterodox beliefs may have quietly existed within the order, particularly among the highest ranks. Others argue that the charges were entirely fabricated, that Philip invented the heresy to justify his seizure of Templar wealth and property. The truth may lie somewhere between, that genuine secrets or unusual practices within the order were distorted and exaggerated by interrogators into something far more sinister than what actually existed. What we can say with confidence is that the interrogations of 1307 established a pattern that would echo through the trial that followed. Confessions extracted under torture became the foundation for the charges. Those confessions, when examined later, would prove contradictory, inconsistent, and shaped by the leading questions of their extractors, and yet they would be presented, in courts and before papal judges, as proof of heresy itself, as evidence that warranted the destruction of an institution that had stood for nearly 2 centuries. The autumn nights grew longer, in the dungeons and the courtrooms, in the chambers where ecclesiastical judges deliberated alongside royal officials. The fate of the order was being written in pain, in doubt, and in the terrible ambiguity of what could be proven and what could merely be claimed. The Knights Templar, who had once seemed as permanent as stone and faith itself, were being unmade not by enemy armies or by the loss of their holy war, but by the machinery of law turned against them, by the questions asked in darkness, and by the confessions that would echo through the centuries to come. The trials that would dismantle an institution of 2 centuries began not in Jerusalem or even in Rome, but in the dark chambers of royal palaces and ecclesiastical dungles scattered across France. In October of 1307, on a day when the autumn light would have been thin and golden across the Seine, King Philip IV of France gave the signal, and something ancient and vast began to come undone. The arrests were synchronized across the kingdom with a precision that spoke to months of careful planning, whispered conferences between the crown and its allies in the church. By nightfall, the Grand Master Jacques de Molay found himself bound and separated from his brothers, and though he did not know it then, his order had entered its final chapter. The charges, when they came forth, seemed to arrive like steam from a cauldron long kept sealed. The Templars were accused of heresy, of denying Christ in secret rituals, of worshipping an idol called Baphomet, of spitting on the cross, of obscene practices conducted beneath their own commandery walls. Some accounts spoke of a mysterious severed head preserved in their chapels, others of worship directed toward ancient forces that predated Christianity itself. The allegations multiplied and shifted even as they were uttered, each interrogation adding new details, each confession under pressure, spawning further accusations that would then be pursued as facts. It is here, in this moment of accumulation, that we must pause and acknowledge something essential. Historians, even now, remain genuinely uncertain about what was true and what was weaponized fiction. What we know with clarity is this: the interrogations were brutal. The word torture, though sometimes softened in medieval records as putting to the question, carried a very literal and very physical meaning. Bones were broken under the weight of iron chairs. Feet were held to flames until the flesh charred. Fingernails were torn away. Under such devastation, men confessed to almost anything, and so Jacques de Molay, who had led the order with devotion if not always with inspired leadership, confessed to denying Christ. He admitted to spitting on the cross. He confirmed elements of the charges that would have seemed incomprehensible to him before the pain began. Were these confessions genuine glimpses into secret heresies harbored within the order, or were they the inevitable product of extremity and despair? The sources themselves divide on this question. Some historians, examining the confessions and the evidence, have suggested that perhaps there existed within certain Templar circles, particularly among the inner circles of initiation, practices or teachings that strayed from Orthodox Christianity, that the order's long isolation in the East, its accumulation of pre-Christian artifacts, its proximity to Saracen and Jewish learning, had subtly altered its theology in ways that left it vulnerable to such charges. Others argue with equal conviction that the accusations were pure fabrication, a carefully constructed narrative designed to justify seizure of Templar assets and to punish an institution that had grown too autonomous, too wealthy, and too independent to suit the ambitions of a French crown perpetually in debt. The truth, like so much of human history, likely resides somewhere in the spaces between these certainties, in the shadowlands where fact and interpretation become almost indistinguishable. What we can trace with more confidence is the arc of the trial itself. The confessions extracted through torture soon began to unravel when they were examined and cross-referenced. Accounts contradicted one another. The same individual might confess to a practice on one day and deny it the next. Torture, it seemed, had proven too efficient. It had produced not truth, but rather an echo of its own suggestions. Some of the accused recanted their confessions before church officials. Jacques de Molay, whose will had been broken in the darkness, began to speak differently once he had been moved from the chamber of interrogation and allowed to breathe clean air. The Pope, Clement V, found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. He had initially been pressed and persuaded by the French king to validate the charges, but as the trial proceeded and contradictions multiplied, even he began to harbor doubts about the solidity of the evidence. Yet momentum, once it has been set in motion, becomes difficult to arrest. The machinery of law and faith, once wound tight, continues to turn, whether or not the evidence justifying its turning remains sound. The trial dragged across years, formal and repetitive, a kind of exhausted performance, where all parties seemed to understand their roles, but no longer quite believed in the narrative they were enacting. In 1312, the Council of Vienne was convened. Bishops and cardinals gathered to determine the fate of an order that had stood for nearly 2 centuries. The Templars were permitted to present their defense, and some princes of the church spoke eloquently on their behalf, noting the dubious nature of the confessions, the signs of coercion, the internal inconsistencies that rendered the entire body of accusations suspect. But the momentum was there, the machinery was turning, and the King of France was watching with intense interest in the outcome. The Pope made his decision in stages, as if reluctant to commit fully to what was coming. The order was, it was declared, not proven guilty beyond reasonable doubt, yet it would be dissolved anyway. The lands and properties of the Templars would be transferred, ostensibly to the Knights Hospitaller, though in practice much of this wealth found its way into French royal coffers, where it would do little to ease the king's chronic financial distress. The reasoning, from the papal perspective, was that even if the charges could not be absolutely established, the scandal surrounding the order was too profound, the doubt too widespread, for it to continue in good conscience. The institution had to end, not necessarily because its guilt was certain, but because its reputation had been so thoroughly shattered that restoration was no longer conceivable. In this way, a body that had withstood crusades and betrayals found itself undone by whispers and burning feet. And so we come to Jacques de Molay in the spring of 1314, on an island in the Seine, as the sky above Paris grew dark with approaching evening. He was old then, worn by years of imprisonment and the accumulated weight of leading an order into its own twilight. The Templars had been formally dissolved 2 years prior, their properties distributed or claimed, their network of commanderies already beginning to crumble into ruin and overgrowth. But the Grand Master's death, it seemed, had been kept in suspension, as if the crown and the church were still uncertain what final use might be made of him. On the orders of the king, or perhaps with the reluctant acquiescence of church authorities, he was brought to an island in the river and bound to a stake, surrounded by wood and kindling. The accounts of what transpired that evening are sparse and sometimes contradictory, as are most records from which so many centuries have since elapsed. Some chroniclers report that he recanted his confessions even as the flames rose around him. Others suggest he died in stoic silence. There is a tradition, recorded by some but disputed by others, that he called upon both his persecutors to meet him before the judgment seat of God. Whether he said these things, or whether they were placed in his mouth by scribes seeking to craft a narrative of defiance and redemption, remains uncertain. What seems clear is that on that evening, an old man died in fire, and with him, the last direct embodiment of an institution that had once seemed as permanent and inevitable as the stones of Jerusalem itself. The papal dissolution that followed was, in some ways, merely the formal recognition of what had already occurred. The Order of the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, which had begun as a vow between 9 knights in the dust of the Holy Land, which had grown to command fortresses and farms across the known world, which had reinvented commerce and banking, which had stood at the right hand of kings and popes, ceased to exist. Its members were scattered or absorbed into other religious orders. Its vast property was eventually divided among competitors. Its name began, almost immediately, to gather myth and speculation and legend, as all things that have been destroyed tend to do, as if the void left behind demanded to be filled with stories. But even now, centuries later, historians sit with the records of the trial spread before them, turning pages, comparing accounts, weighing the language of confessions against the physical evidence of torture, asking the same difficult question that the Pope himself seemed to harbor in his final years. Did the Templars fall because they were guilty, or because their wealth and independence had become inconvenient to the powers that surrounded them? The answer remains suspended in the ambiguity of history, neither fully proven nor entirely disprovable. A reminder that sometimes the most significant events in human affairs occur not in the light of certainty, but in the twilight of doubt and competing claims. And perhaps that uncertainty is itself the most honest thing we can say about it all. And so the order dissolved into smoke and memory, yet something extraordinary happened in the centuries that followed. The Templars, who had ceased to exist in any official capacity by the early 1400s, began to live again, not in documents or stone keeps, but in the imaginations of those who came after, in the careful rituals of secret societies, in whispered legends passed hand to hand like precious relics. The very destruction of their order seemed to grant them an immortal kind of power, the power of the unexplained, the hidden, the deliberately erased from history. Consider what a blank canvas their absence created. After 1314, when Jacques de Molay's ashes scattered into the River Seine, there were no more Templars to speak for themselves, no living voice to say what they had truly been or believed. Instead, the void they left began to fill with speculation, with symbol, with the deep human hunger to find meaning in secrets. And perhaps this is where the real story becomes most fascinating, not because the conspiracies were true, but because the longing to believe them tells us something profound about ourselves. Among the first to adopt the Templar legacy were the Freemasons. Beginning in the 17th and 18th centuries, as Freemasonry spread through Europe like a mirror, reflecting back what each nation hoped to see, certain lodges began to claim that their rituals and symbols descended directly from the Templars. They spoke of secret initiation rites, preserved through the centuries, passed from the last knights to trusted allies, guarded in the shadows while kings and popes thought the order dead. The imagery was deeply appealing. Geometric symbols that had once adorned Templar seals, the square, the compass, the interlocking triangles, began to appear in Masonic lodges, from London to Lyon. The narrative was elegant and powerful, a brotherhood of knowledge keepers, silently transmitting ancient wisdom through the dangerous years when such knowledge had to hide. But here is where we must gently step back and acknowledge what historians have found when they examine the actual evidence. The connection between the Templars and Freemasonry, while emotionally resonant and symbolically rich, rests on very thin ground. Most Masonic historians today acknowledge that these links were likely invented or greatly elaborated in retrospect, perhaps in the 18th century when romantic notions of lost medieval secrets had particular appeal. The symbols do overlap, yes, but symbols have always been borrowed and reinterpreted across centuries. What seems certain is that Freemasonry drew inspiration from Templar legend whether or not there was any actual organizational continuity. The Templars became, in a sense, the mythic ancestors that Freemasonry chose for itself. From the Freemasons, the Templar legend branched into even more elaborate territories. Consider the remarkable Scottish chapel that sits near Edinburgh, Rosslyn Chapel, completed in 1486 by Henry Sinclair. Its walls are covered in carved symbols, strange astronomical carvings, what some interpret as maize plants from the New World, intricate geometric patterns that seem almost to hum with hidden meaning. For centuries, visitors have whispered that this chapel was built by surviving Templars, that it contains knowledge brought back from Jerusalem, that its very architecture encodes sacred mysteries. The appeal of Rosslyn is visceral. Standing inside, surrounded by stone flowers and carved faces, and patterns that seem to shift meaning depending on how the light falls, it is easy to feel that you are in a building that was meant to conceal something precious. And the Sinclair family, who built the chapel, did have documented connections to the Crusades and to Scottish nobility during the period when Templars were being hunted. But does the architecture itself prove Templar involvement? Does a carved rose or a five-pointed star confirm secret knowledge? Here is where we must be honest. The evidence for direct Templar participation in Rosslyn's construction, while tantalizing to imagine, remains entirely circumstantial. What we know is that the Sinclairs were wealthy, cultured, connected to networks of learning and trade. What we want to believe is that they were the last keepers of Templar secrets. These are not necessarily the same thing. And then there is the Holy Grail, perhaps the most persistent and captivating of all the mysteries attached to the Templar name. The legend is so old, so woven through Western consciousness, that it seems almost natural to assume the Templars must have been connected to it. Some versions of the story claim they found it during the Crusades, hidden beneath the Temple of Solomon. Others suggest they brought it to Scotland, that it rests somewhere beneath Rosslyn or in one of the Scottish Isles, guarded by descendants who have kept the secret through centuries. The imagery is overwhelming. The Templars as custodians of the holiest object in Christendom, their quest for spiritual knowledge manifesting not as mere faith, but as the pursuit of divinity itself made tangible. But what does the historical record actually show? There is no contemporary evidence that Templars ever claimed to possess the Grail. The earliest written version of the Grail legend, the Tale of Perceval by Chrétien de Troyes, was written in the 12th century, when the Templars were still active, yet makes no mention of them. The elaborate fusion of the Grail with Templar history appears to be a much later invention, perhaps gaining particular momentum in the 19th and 20th centuries, when the romance of medieval mysteries held special appeal for an increasingly modern world. What may have happened is this. The Grail legend, existing independently, eventually encountered the legend of the Templars, and because both carried tremendous symbolic weight, because both spoke to humanity's hunger for the sacred and the hidden, they became entangled in the popular imagination. The Grail found, so to speak, the perfect guardians in legend, even if history tells a different story. Now, how do we navigate these waters? How do we honor the genuine mystique that surrounds the Templars without surrendering to invention? The answer lies in what historians call source discipline. We ask, what can be documented? What do contemporary records say? What is speculation, however beautiful? The Templars, in this method, emerge as something remarkable enough without needing embellishment. They were genuinely mysterious in their operations. They did hold real power and real wealth. They were genuinely persecuted. Their actual story, traced through charters and trial records and archaeological remains, is dramatic and moving and strange enough. What they did not do, or at least what we have no credible evidence they did, is guard the Grail or maintain secret societies that preserved their wisdom through the ages. This distinction matters, not because the truth is less interesting than the myth, but because truth is more resilient. The actual Templars, warriors and monks who struggled to maintain a holy war in a land that would not stay conquered, who invented banking systems and tried to balance their poverty vows with their enormous wealth, who were ultimately destroyed by a king who feared them. These actual Templars are figures of genuine complexity and pathos. They failed. They fell. They were remembered in some cases with gratitude, and in others with suspicion, and that is enough. So when you encounter the modern manifestations of Templar legend, the movies and novels that place them at the heart of vast conspiracies, the websites that promise to reveal their real secrets, the societies that claim direct descent from their order, you might approach them with a kind of gentle skepticism. Not cynicism, but a quiet discernment. Ask what is documented and what is desired. The human impulse to find hidden meaning, to believe that somewhere beneath the surface of the world there exists a brotherhood devoted to preserving sacred knowledge. This is understandable and even beautiful. It speaks to a deep human longing. But it is a longing we are projecting onto the Templars, not something they left behind for us to find. What they did leave is something more precious in its way, a genuine history of ambition and failure, faith and doubt, power and its consequences, written across 900 years and preserved in the patient work of those who seek to understand what actually was, rather than only what we wish had been. If you were to walk across the worn stones of what remains of the Templar commandery at Chinon today, the cold would rise up through your boots, and the light would fall in the same pale geometry it always has. The walls still stand in places, though no knight has walked them in 7 centuries. The keep at Chastel Blanc, perched on a hilltop in Syria, crumbles slowly into the dust from which it was built. Its chambers open to the sky now, the prayer bells long silenced. And somewhere in the twilight of those ruins, something endures that no fire could fully extinguish. Not the institution itself, which was torn apart and buried deliberately, but the imprint of it, the question of it. We have traveled through 900 years of their story, from those first 9 nights, sworn and uncertain, riding the dusty roads near Jerusalem to protect pilgrims who carried nothing but faith and the knowledge that danger waited at every pass. We watched them rise from poverty to become the richest institution in Christendom, their seal showing 2 men on a single horse, not because they could not afford a second mount, but because they were, in their very beginning, bound together by something that looked like both devotion and necessity. We saw them build commanderies from the frozen north to the sunburned south, each one a knot in a network that held pilgrims' gold and kingdoms' secrets in careful balance. The Templars understood something that took centuries for the world to fully recognize, that wealth and faith could be twins, that a man could kneel in prayer at dawn and calculate compound interest by evening, and this was not necessarily corruption. It was adaptation. It was survival. They became bankers and diplomats and keepers of roads when the Crusades themselves began to hollow out, when the romantic notion of religious war gave way to the harder mathematics of geography and politics and supply lines. A pilgrim traveling to Rome no longer needed to carry 50 pounds of silver sewn into his cloak. He carried instead a letter of credit, a small piece of parchment that promised him safety and access to money in another city. This was revolution, though it happened so quietly that many never noticed. And yet, what empire ends cleanly? What institution, no matter how powerful, goes gentle into the darkness? The arrests came on a Friday morning in October, and the speed of it suggests something that had been carefully planned, quietly discussed, arranged in whispers between men in power. King Philip of France looked at the wealth he could not touch and made a choice. Whether the charges were real or fabricated remains one of history's stubborn riddles. The confessions came under torture, which means they came from pain rather than memory. The heresy accusations, the supposed worship of a severed head, the denied divinity of Christ, the secret rites in darkness, have never been proven. Yet neither have they been entirely dismissed. Historians still turn them over, like stones looking for something caught underneath. And we may never know with certainty whether the Templars harbored secret beliefs or whether they were simply the convenient target of a king who needed gold and a church that needed to re-establish its authority. Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master, spent years in captivity. He was an old man when they burned him, and the sources tell us he recanted his confession at the end, though what he said in those final moments is clouded by time and by the different accounts that survived. Some said he cursed the king and the pope to meet him before God's throne. Some said he died in silence. We do not know which version touches closest to the truth, and perhaps that uncertainty is itself a kind of truth, the acknowledgement that some moments are too urgent, too full of human complexity, to be flattened into a single narrative. What we do know is that the order was dissolved, its lands were scattered, its knights dispersed into the world as ghosts of themselves, some retreating to monasteries, some finding employment with other noble houses, some disappearing into obscurity so complete that we do not even have names to attach to them. The institution that had seemed eternal, that had weathered the fall of the Crusader states and the shifting allegiances of kingdoms, could not withstand the deliberate will of earthly power. And yet something of it refused to die. In the centuries after, the legends grew. Freemasonry claimed descent from the Templars, borrowed symbols and narrative threads that connected secret societies through centuries of European history. Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland began to attract pilgrims who imagined that the Templars had hidden treasures there, sacred relics spirited away in the chaos of dissolution. The Holy Grail narratives began to whisper that perhaps, just perhaps, the Templars had known something, guarded something, carried forward some secret knowledge that the official church wanted erased. Whether any of this is true matters far less than the fact that people wanted it to be true. The Templars had become myth before they had finished being history. But here is what we know with certainty. For nearly 200 years, the Templars held their ground in the Levant. They died in numbers at Hattin, and their survivors rebuilt. They fought at Montgisard and Jerusalem, at Acre, and dozens of smaller keeps whose names have faded. They harbored refugees, fed the hungry, arranged ransoms. They made loans to kings and stored treasures in their vaults and, yes, accumulated wealth and power. They were complicated men, no more purely noble than any human institution, no more purely corrupt either. They were warriors and monks, which is to say, they carried contradiction inside themselves like a constant weight. The keeps stand empty now, or nearly so. The one at Templecombe, in Somerset, reduced to foundation stones and the memory of walls. The one at Tolosa, in Spain, its great chapel open to the weather. You can walk where they walked, if you know where to find the places. You can stand in the ruin of their grandeur and feel how the wind moves differently when there is no one to hear it but ghosts. What rises from all of this, after 9 centuries of crusade and conspiracy, of wealth and war, and the human hunger for certainty in an uncertain world, is not a clear answer, but a deeper question. These men believed that salvation could be found in action, that faith expressed itself not in contemplation alone, but in the sword, in the fortress, in the network of obligation that bound together Christian kingdoms. They built something extraordinary because they believed in something extraordinary. And when that belief no longer served the interests of the powerful, the institution was dismantled. The myth remained, growing larger and stranger with each retelling, until finally, it is almost impossible to see the actual men beneath the legend. Perhaps that is their true legacy, not the treasures or the secrets or the religious mysteries, but the simple fact that they were remembered, that centuries later, people still wonder about them, still ask questions, still imagine that somewhere in the gaps between history and myth, something true and important lies waiting. The Templars taught the world how to move money across borders, how to trust in a piece of parchment, how to believe in something large enough to organize entire lives around. And when they fell, they left behind not only ruins, but the haunting sense that human institutions, no matter how powerful, are always temporary, always subject to the calculations of kings and the shifting needs of the church. The firelight fades now, the candles in those stone chambers burned out centuries ago. What remains is stillness, and the fading glow on ancient stones, and the long night ahead in which all stories, eventually, come to rest.